And today we have a guest who you have heard on the show here before, and Barbara Harris Whitfield, not to mention, is a very kind and loving person. You know how when you read someone's book, you're hoping that they're a lot like their book, and she is very much very kind, kind of angelic, very
Oh boy.
sweet. She really is. And the first time I got to know her was through reading this book, Final Passages. I couldn't put it down until about 3 o'clock in the morning. I sobbed. It was just so, to me, that's a positive thing, if you're thinking that's a bad thing. It was really wonderful. It was very heart-opening, encouraging, inspirational. And I'm not going to tell you about it because she's going to explain why the book was so much like that. But Final Passages, her latest book, which is one of 3 books, is no mere recounting of case studies of the dying process. That's a quote from Jack McBride, who's executive director of Shepherd's Gate Hospice in Covington, Georgia. But Barbara Harris Whitfield, along with being a workshop presenter, author, national speaker, therapist, she was featured by Deepak Chopra on her groundbreaking research on the after effects of near-death experiences in his newsletter, Infinite Possibilities for Body, Mind, and Soul. She's also a consulting editor and a contributing writer for the Journal of Near-Death Studies and a member of the executive board of the Kundalini Research Network. She works as a thanatologist and a workshop presenter, and she has a private practice here in Atlanta, Georgia, and does have openings, by the way, in group. And her husband are presenting the Course in Miracles here in Atlanta at the Unity Church and presenting in workshops nationwide. So welcome to the show, Barbara.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And it's Atlanta Unity on Chamblee Dunwoody, and it's Tuesday evening from 7:30 till 9. We are teachers and we're students of A Course in Miracles.
And for those of you who are not familiar with the Course in Miracles, her husband will be on the show to talk about that for an hour. It's a wonderful spiritual adjunct to recovery, especially, but anyone dealing with mental health issues and self-help and growth, wanting to better themselves. Well, let's just talk a little bit about this book, Final Passages. As I said, to me, it was very heartwarming and heart-opening, and it's about your experience with helping people transition.
Yeah, there are 11 stories in there of people that I've helped die, and I had really never planned on writing a book about this. I mean, these were stories that I just carried in my heart. And then the first story, the second story in the book, the story of Sherry Rosen, I had a hospice nurse say to me, you know, what did you do that was different? Because when she came in towards the end, she could not believe what she was experiencing. So I started writing her story out to explain to this hospice nurse, and then my editor from my publisher, Health Communications, said to me when I told him about it, you need to write several stories. This is a book. And that's how the book got started. But these are very, very personal stories, and I write from my heart. It was the feelings that I was going through as I was helping these people die.
Well, let's back up for a second and help. Some people have probably heard you before on the show, but let's tell people a little bit about your experience. And also why this is important and related to addiction and recovery on the show. I know you and your husband do a lot with recovering people, helping them deal with their spirituality. And my experience as a therapist, death anxiety, grief, all those issues are part and parcel of what causes addictions, and also what really needs to be looked at. So maybe you could say a little bit about stage 2 and stage 3 recovery.
Yeah. You know, first of all, I want to tell the audience who my husband is in case they don't know. He's Charles Whitfield, and he's the author of the bestseller Healing the Child Within, that came out over 10, 12 years ago and is still selling in large numbers all the time, because he defined, I think he was the one that defined, of course I'm a little prejudiced, but I think
well,
he's
I agree
the one
with
that
you,
defined where we needed to heal if we were adult children of dysfunctional families. I had a near-death experience in 1975, long before I met Charlie. And what happened for me in my near-death experience, I went into that experience an atheist, by the way. I was numbed out from what I would consider a severely dysfunctional childhood. And I had really lost contact with myself, with my true self, and I had certainly lost contact with my ability to experience spirit or God or whatever you want to call it. So I was a pretty numb atheist and started to die after spinal surgery, and had this elaborate near-death experience. And at the time, I had no words for any of it, but I was in the tunnel. Took me a long time to use that word. And my grandmother was there, and she had been dead for 14 years, and I had never, ever thought of her existing beyond her death. And she held me, and she loved me the way she had as a child. She was my one place where I could go and be, enveloped with love. Home was pretty rough. My mother was addicted to prescription drugs. Anyway, my grandmother was there, and she held me, and she loved me the way she had when she was on this planet. And then I had what we call a classic life review. I re-experienced all 32 years of my life, and I remember my sense through the whole thing was saying, no wonder, no wonder. And what that no wonder meant to me was, no wonder I am the way I am. You know, I'm a pretty crazy person, but look what happened to me as a child. Of course I was going to wind up being this crazy. But also at the same time, I was getting in touch with my true self, my child within, whatever you want to call it, my authentic self, who I would have been as an adult if I hadn't have been so abused as a child. And I came back with that knowledge that there was a real me that I could not bring out into the way my life was set up. And for me, it was a 20-year search to be able to exist on this planet as the real me, not who my family wanted me to be, not who my friends thought I was, but who I really knew I was. One thing led to another. I became a nurse, an RT, a respiratory therapist, and started writing about these experiences because my patients were having them, my ICU patients were having them. And I was talking about true self. I was lucky enough to be asked to join a group of researchers at the University of Connecticut Medical School where I did 6 years of research in the psych department on the after effects of people who have nearly died and had these experiences. And what I was looking for in my research was a way to explain how we can be this way all the time. Okay, that this isn't
Right.
just something that happens after we die. We can be real now.
Right.
And then I met Charlie and opened his book, Healing the Child Within, and I realized that we didn't have to reinvent the wheel, that the near-death researchers didn't have to explain
Right.
again what this was all about, that the recovery movement already knew about this, and they were talking about stages of recovery. And I got really excited, and my second book, Spiritual Awakenings, is incorporating the recovery movement for people that have had this experience. And originally I was going to call that book When the 12th Step Happens First.
Right. That's
Because
a good title.
yeah, and NDEers, near-death experiencers, are having their 12th step, and then we're realizing that we came from dysfunctional families and we want to be real all the time the way we were when we were dying. So with Charlie's work, I incorporated it into mine, and what I came up with was that we're having these experiences in what he calls stage 0 or stage 1, when we're still addicted, or we have some kind of physical illness too. It doesn't have to be an addiction. We can have a physical, bad backs, migraine headaches, ulcers, colitis, all these physical illnesses we're now taking a second look at and saying, this could be the way we're working through our dysfunctional
Right.
childhood. So that stage 1 would be to address those physical illnesses. Stage 2 specific, and that's where we have a lot of our therapy groups. Stage 2 is specifically to address the trauma of our childhoods, to sit in a group that feels very safe and be real and talk about where we're having troubles in our life now and what does that remind us from our childhood, so that we can again go back and name what happened and let it go. We're not blaming anybody, we're naming what happened. And then there's a newer area now, which for me is the most exciting. We are starting stage 3 groups, therapy groups, where we've already done our stage 2 trauma work, and we're ready to talk about spirit and how we can incorporate the spiritual into our lives. We can not only be real with ourselves, we can be real with our God, and we can bring spirit into all of our relationships. So we have stage 2 and stage 3 groups that we're running.
Oh, that is great. So for those of you that just tuned in, we are talking with Barbara Harris Whitfield, and a little bit of information. She was mentioning stage 2 and stage 3. They do have openings in that group. And for most people, a sort of a spiritual awakening can happen whether you have, like she mentioned, a drug addiction, problem with alcoholism, a major depression, some sort of chronic medical problem. And many times those are the things that lead us to a crisis and to some sort of life review. So you are probably open to taking clients who are ready for that sort of stage 2 or stage 3 recovery, even if they're not addicted.
Right.
Okay,
Right.
great. So probably adult children of alcoholics, codependents, people surviving from dysfunctional families.
Right.
So Final Passage is more about your experience with helping people to die. And, you know, many people would say, this must be a depressing book, Barbara.
No, it's not a depressing book. It's a very uplifting book, according to everybody who's read it. I know when I was writing it, it was just a wonderful experience to take what was in my heart for so long and find words to explain it. I include in there both my parents' deaths, and for my mother was my abuser, and I did the best that I could witnessing her death. She certainly wouldn't let me help her. She was in denial the whole time. So I don't want the listening audience to think that every one of these stories are the best that can happen. I realized that I had to be honest and also talk about what is it like when we're helping our abuser die or we're witnessing our abuser die. And my father, as, the dear soul that he was still a co-abuser by allowing her to have abused me the way she did. And so there was a lot of healing that went on between him and me as I helped him die. He was very open to the help. And then there's stories of several of my patients and two dear friends. There's something that's going on when people are dying that we're not doing, and that's what this book addresses. And I used to work in labor and delivery rooms in my younger days and realized the presence of spirit as a baby was being born. It's just so profound. It's like you can almost palpate it in the room. Mm. And if the mother's awake and alert, she's feeling it too. And when that baby comes out, there's just this incredible sense that spirit has brought this baby to us. Well, there's the same thing going on when people die. There is spirit. And if we would just step back and give up control of the situation and allow spirit to do its thing, we can palpate the exact same sense in the room. And although we're very sad to say goodbye, we're very sad to let go, there's something going on that's so much greater than the letting go if we'll only be open to it. That's why I wrote this book.
I think my favorite story, I think it was Sherry's, who died
Sherry
in her
Rosen,
home.
yeah, 48 years old.
I think that for some reason that was my favorite stories of all the ones I read, and it was also maybe the first one. But let's talk a little bit about, you did touch on it in that story, how she had to come to peace with some issues in her childhood before she could really, I guess, peacefully die.
Yeah, Sherry came from a very abusive childhood and was very bitter about it. And in her 40s, started working on all those issues and developed cancer in January. She knew about it, and she died in September, so she went very, very quickly. But she did everything she wanted to do before she left. I came in the last week before she died, and the one thing she hadn't done was made peace with her family. Her abuser had already died, so her abuser wasn't there, but the people who allowed it to happen, she felt, were there, the other members of her family. And again, I came in with no agenda. That it wasn't my job for her to decide what she was going to do with the time she had left. But I just feel that caregivers, well, let me back up a little bit. We've got this old adage here in this part of the world about don't just stand there, do something. And what I attempt to do is don't just do something, stand there.
Exactly. I love that. That's great.
Just stand there. Just be a witness
That's
to
wonderful.
what's going on. And when people want validation, I'm going to validate. And
Right.
if they ask me to, I can be an interpreter between them and their families, which a little bit of that went on. And then Spirit was there, too. And the coincidences or synchronicities that were going on during her death were amazing. One example would be that we got very bored. It's very boring.
I remember reading it, right?
Yeah, so she finally said to me, flip on the TV. We were alone in the room. And what did I flip it on to? But Steel Magnolias
Right.
and that breathtaking scene with Sally Field where she's screaming at the cemetery because she's lost a child. And here was Sherry's father in the other room. And the whole scene was so profound. I mean, they had asked if they could do a prayer ceremony in the house, which I thought would be wonderful because just to have that energy washing through the house. She had been against it, but she finally gave in and said, okay. She was very angry that she hadn't died yet. She didn't want this to keep going on. And from the stairwell, we heard her father at the end of the prayer ceremony saying this beautiful, beautiful poem to his daughter, How Do I Love Thee? Let Me Count the Ways, And from that moment and the Steel Magnolias, I saw her start to turn around as far as negotiating with her family and finally allowing everybody in, so that when Sherry did die 24 hours later, instead of everybody being kept in the other room, everybody was in the room surrounding her, and she was able to say her final goodbyes.
I remember that part of the book, and I was trying to understand, for some reason, her father reading that helped her come to terms with forgiveness.
No, what happened was that when her father was reading that, I could not help myself. I started to sob. So my own stuff was coming in, My father had died a year earlier, and I just really missed him. So I was sobbing, and she said to me, what's wrong with you? And I, you're not supposed to be doing that. And I apologized, and I said, I lost my father a year ago, and your father's poem to you was just so touching. And I think that just me revealing to her that I was grieving for my father was part of what helped turn her around.
It was wonderful because I kept reading that thinking, how did suddenly she get to terms with it? I guess the thing that is so important for listeners is that, the stuff that we don't heal or don't change, and luckily for her, she did turn it around with your help and with her father's. But that does prevent us from having peace on earth, and then really even peace as we're dying.
Right.
And obviously being a therapist, it's so important to me. But that was just a beautiful way to describe that, and how she finally could let go and be ready to die gracefully instead of angrily.
Right. And one of the last things she said at one point, everybody was circling her in the room, and she looked like this was it. And after about an hour of everybody watching her like that, she opened her eyes and she said, "What is this? What do you all think I'm dead? This was just a dress rehearsal." So she even had some humor at the end, and there was a lot of laughter. And what I witnessed at the end was that everybody was sharing stories. They sat, and most of the people in that room with her, there were 14 people, aunts, uncles, cousins. Most of them were older than her, so this was really hard for them to let go of somebody younger. But everybody started telling stories, memories, and they had the best time. Everybody was glowing, and what was happening was everybody was pouring love into that room.
It's just so beautiful. I still cry as you talk about it, and that was the story in the book. Those of you that are listening, you have to get it. It was so beautiful. Again, it's not depressing. It is heart-opening, and recovering people hate it when they cry. They think there's something wrong, but it's healing.
When recovering people cry, what we're doing is emptying our heart of all those unshed tears that we need to do.
But I'm crying, Suzi.
Yeah.
I'm like, you need to cry.
Yeah, crying is healthy.
It's good for you. The other story, Unconditional Love, May Doherty's story.
Doherty.
Could you tell us that?
What a wonderful woman. This is my girlfriend's mother, and I also tell the story of her dad dying. And May was in her late 70s, and Jim died at 96. He stayed around 7 years longer. We didn't expect him to, but he did. May was this very, very loving soul. She was just light radiated from her face. And meeting her was just the most wonderful thing for me, because her kids were all my age, and I could see a family of 7 kids, and I could see a mother that really knew what unconditional love was and gave it to her kids.
That is so wonderful.
Yeah. And her death, too, was beautiful. I think people die the way they lived, and she died with her kids surrounding her, praying in prayer. Up until like the day before she died, there was a lot of levity there. There was a lot of joking around going on. They were still kowtowing to, I tell the story, I think 2 days before she died, the kids were, I asked her, I have to back up a little. She was in a hospital bed in the den on the first floor, and she couldn't really move anymore. She had stomach cancer, so she just was too much pain. And she could only lay the way where she was looking at the wall. And I leaned over and I said, "May, what are you looking at?" And she said, "The wallpaper." And I said, "Boy, it's got to be pretty boring. What would you like to look at?" And she said, "My kids." So we grabbed a Polaroid camera, and everybody ran onto the front porch, and we got this gorgeous shot of her 7, kids. And we brought the Polaroid in, and I put it up on the wall, and she said, "That's not the color I told the painter to make the front door. It's supposed to be bittersweet orange." So I go running around this house yelling, "Hey guys, everybody get together here. The door is the wrong color." And somebody came up with bittersweet orange paint that was in the basement, and they painted the front door and took the picture again. And I brought it into her, and we stuck it on the wall, and she said to me, "Now that's bittersweet." So that was May. And then when she actually died, as I said, her 7 kids were chanting around her. And Jim came in at the end, and he got down on his knees, and they looked at
her husband?
Yeah, total eye contact. And tears in their eyes, didn't have to say a word. I mean, this was after 60-some years of marriage. And what had happened was Jim had turned off the grandfather's clock in the other room a few weeks earlier because the chiming was bothering her, okay? So he got up and went into the other room. He knew she wouldn't die in front of him. She had never given birth in front of him either. They had their boundaries. He went into the other room, and he started the grandfather's clock again. And as he was setting the time, he was turning the hands of the clock. It was chiming. So the kids, these are in their 50s, are praying, and all these chimes were going on in the next room. And it reminded me of a cathedral during just the most sacred moments. And that was the way May left. And she deserved to go like that.
Well, I'm crying the whole time we're talking, Barbara. It's so
But
beautiful.
see,
I
people
love it.
deserve this. I know that, we want to shy away from the pain that we may feel, but people
I
deserve
agree.
an honorable way to go.
My father just finished his last round of chemotherapy a couple of months ago, so probably for me it's especially important to be
Yeah.
talking about this and share this tape and this book with him. Strength is called, Jim's story is called Strength.
Yeah. Yeah. Jim, as I said, took 7 years longer. Jim went on.
Oh, it's her husband.
Yes, yes. And he was a Superior Court judge, and he was just a wonderful, wonderful character, is the only way I can describe Jim. He did have so much strength. And when my editor asked me to name these stories, I had to think a while, except with Jim. With Jim, I knew it was strength right away. He lived another 7 years to the age of 96.
Ugh.
He let his children know that in no way did he want to be taken from his home, that he wanted to die at home. They honored that by bringing in somebody during the day to do the cooking and, keep an eye on him. And then at night they had a man come in, this very, very loving, big, big black man from Jamaica who just hugged him and loved him, got him ready for bed every night, and would leave. And one morning when the woman came in, that was the day woman, he wasn't sitting at the kitchen table the way he normally did. And she found him in bed, and he had died. And what was amazing was the kids had bought him this little alarm to wear around his neck, and he could hit the button at any time, and the paramedics would come. He had taken that off, and he had put it on his bedside table. I think that was the last message he left was, I'm doing this on my own. I don't need people around me. But that was the way he wanted to go, and everybody was able to honor it.
That's so wonderful. I didn't read all these stories. I just love how you so openly and easily talk about this and deal with helping people to do this.
Well, those 6 years of research that I did with people who have had near-death experiences, we all talk about not being afraid to help people die, and we all talk about either doing that as a volunteer, or I was lucky enough to turn it into my profession. But we are comfortable with it because we know where they're going, and we know they're safe. So for us, it's like a rite of passage for them. It's not the Grim Reaper that we used to think it was.
Right. It's so wonderful. We just have a few minutes left on this side of the show. I'm curious. I listen to radio all the time, obviously, but everything from talk sports to the Christian radio stations for good interviews and things like that. But there's been a lot of controversy on the Christian radio stations right now about near-death experiences.
Oh, really? I haven't been listening.
Oh, I should have called you and had you hear it, because it's pissing me off because they're making it sound like. Well, I guess these are maybe ignorant people, a couple doctors who are saying this, but they're making it sound like it's a negative thing.
Oh, yeah. I've argued on Donahue a few years ago with,
Okay, good.
I can't remember his name, but he's from the University of Tennessee, and he came out with a book called To Hell and Back.
And that's, to me, it's ridiculous,
Yeah.
because I think the main point they're trying to make is that people aren't taking responsibility for the negative aspects. But from everything I'm reading in your near-death experience book and what happens many times to people who aren't taking responsibility, they're given this life review, right?
Right, exactly. And what we're finding out is that it's not God that's judging us, it's us. That we have to go through the pain that we created in other people's lives. And that's a pretty painful thing to have to go through. We also get to re-experience all the love we gave out. So it's not, God is not an old man with a long white beard sitting in judgment of us. We have to judge ourselves. We have to feel that pain. And, I think that the fundamentalists are very threatened by near-death experiences and any kind of spiritual experience, because it's taking the power away from the church as the Redeemer, and it's giving us the capacity to connect up to our spiritual nature ourselves, not have to go through the church. And that's very, very threatening.
But if you're Catholic, that's basically what the Holy Spirit is, and what, trusting internally in Christ as your Savior if you're a Christian. So anyway, we just touched on a little bit of controversy. We're going to have to take a little bit of a break. And this is Suzi Marsh with Choosing Life. We'll be right back. 3, 2, 1, mark. Welcome back. You are listening to Choosing Life, Addictions, Mental Health, and Recovery. I'm your host, Suzi Marsh from the Alliance Center. And remember, this is a public affairs presentation of B98.5 FM. I forgot to give out Barbara's number. And if you'd like to reach her, her number is 404-843-4300. That number again, 404-843-4300. And they do have openings in their groups. They do present workshops and have a private practice in therapy, so you're welcome to call her. We just ended the first half of our show with a little bit of the controversy about how some of the Christian literature out now is against near-death experiences, and I think it seems to be a misinterpretation. I've also noticed that it's usually males that are promoting this negative view, but in my opinion, any surrender to an illness, whether it's addiction or some sort of chronic illness, people have to have some sort of life review and take responsibility, and it seems to me like all the near-death experiences make you do that.
Absolutely.
And it's so, anyway, it's just so ridiculous.
It's ridiculous because, it's ridiculous from my angle because this is what I've experienced, and you can't explain an experience to somebody who hasn't had it. Experiences are deeply personal things. So if somebody from the Christian Coalition is going to tell me I'm wrong and this is the devil and all of that, I can't argue with them on that level. I know what I've experienced, and I know that it's changed my life. And I've interviewed hundreds of people who have had near-death experiences, and it's changed their lives. And in 99% of the cases who have had these experiences, they're not afraid to die. But we can't explain that to somebody who hasn't had the experience.
But also by their works you shall know them.
Right.
If you look at somebody who had an experience, what happens after they have their near-death experience?
Right, and
they have a change in their life, right?
The story, Christmas Carol, about Ebenezer Scrooge is the classic example. I mean, he turned out to be a good person after being who he was before. How do you argue with that? Can you tell me that's the work of the devil?
Exactly. It's so bizarre.
Yeah.
It's so bizarre. So anyway, I just had to add that in there because I know that I have a lot of Christian listeners, and I just think it's so important to understand the psychological and spiritual benefit of this work.
Yeah, and I've looked into all the major world religions, and as a group of researchers, I think we've pretty much covered the primitive and the sophisticated religions of the world. And the Holy Spirit, and spirit is what I'm talking about now, the Holy Spirit of Christianity, divine spirit of the Native American Indian, Ruach HaKodesh, according to the Hebrews. You go into the East and it's called Kundalini or Chi or Ki energy. This energy exists, and no particular religion has a patent on it. This is not a brand, they're giving their own brand names, but this is generic. We all have this energy, this spiritual energy, and this spiritual energy connects us to ourselves, it connects us to other people, and it connects us to God.
I was just thinking that a lot of times when I work with a client who has incredible denial about an addiction or about death or something, one of the things I do, I'll ask them, I'll say, well, why don't you pray every morning for insight into this? And, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this isn't an addiction. So don't drink, but pray every morning and every night. Let me have insight whether or not I really am an alcoholic or whether or not whatever. Mm-hmm. And that seems to make a shift when nothing that I do, reading, homework, nothing makes a shift, but being willing to open up to that energy, which is also usually brings you to truth.
Right. And A Course in Miracles talks about all we really need is a little bit of willingness.
Exactly.
Spirit does the rest. If we just have this little bit of willingness to ask, and the prayer doesn't have to be any more than help.
Right.
Help will do it. And the other thing that we have to realize for those of us that are recovering is that we can't feel it experientially if we're still in our false self. If we're still functioning from ego, we can't feel any of this. It's true self, it's child within that is able to experience spirit directly, and that's one of the big reasons why we need to work on ourselves and get back to being who we really are. And going back to my book, Final Passage, sometimes people don't realize their true self until that last minute or 10 minutes or hour or day. In Shirley's story, it was the day before she died.
Let's talk about her story.
It took her up until the last day before she died to be her real self. And she felt spirit. She said it as she was leaving, that she finally was able to feel what other people had told her existed. She had been a student of A Course in Miracles for several years and still didn't get it. It was all still an intellectual head trip. But that last 24 hours when she was able to relax and let her family and spirit arrive for her, and that was because she was being authentic. I start the book off saying the only real pain when we die is if we do it without living first. And even though I didn't even know about the recovery movement when I wrote that, I wrote this little poem years ago, I knew that I was in terrible pain before I had my near-death experience because I was phony. I was living the kind of life that everybody else wanted me to live. So the only real pain when you die is if you do it without living first. Once I became real, once I faced myself and my past and my traumas and everything that I needed to heal, I could be real all the time. And being real is where life is. Being numb is walking around on this planet dead.
I think everything you said is so true. And I remember times of feeling, even for me, before a lot of healing work had happened, I'm dying.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's nothing wrong with my
Yeah.
body, but I literally can tell my spirit is like sinking in into itself. And what you said is amazing. And you think being real, when you come from a family of narcissists who are never wrong, to be real may mean to be wrong, and it feels like a death in itself.
Right.
But then
Right.
it's a rebirth. So.
Right, exactly. And the rebirth is where all the action is.
I'm going to die. I'm going to die. Oh my God, I'm born. It is so beautiful. Well, we have about 20 or so minutes left. And if you just tuned in, you're listening to Choosing Life, Addictions, Mental Health, and Recovery. And Barbara Harris Whitfield is on the show talking about her latest book, Final Passage. Her other books, which are wonderful, Full Circle, The Near-Death Experience, and Beyond. And again, this book, Final Passage. Spiritual Awakenings, Insights of the Near-Death Experience, and Other Doorways to Our Soul was a really beautiful book that we talked about on the show before, about people's experiences with spirit, Holy Spirit, energy, chi, ki, but finally having...
And the after effects, because that's what's so important. I mean, as researchers in the field, for years we were just worshiping the experience and not going any further. And I was saying, hey, wait a minute, guys. We do not come back totally healed. We come back and we need help. You know, we found out who we really were in our experiences, and now we're back here. Do we have to wait until we die again to be who we really are? No, there's got to be a way to be this way on the planet, not wait until it's over. So we started looking at after effects. We started asking people, and people were saying, oh, my life has never been the same. And people are volunteering to work at hospice, and people are going back to school and taking on a new profession that is usually in the helping areas. And all these changes are going on, so we realized that we needed to honor the after effects. And that's what the second book, Spiritual Awakenings, is about. It's honoring the fact that, yes, we are changing, and all these changes are good. Some people treat changes like it's a dirty thing, and it's not. Changing is growth, and it's healing.
I remember when I finally really started to understand what had happened in my life and what I'd been denying for so long. That night was the night that I knew that what my life was going to be for from then on out. I mean, I had no idea before, but I knew that night what I was called to do, which was helping people with addictions and family trauma and those kind of things. So it does. It's a life-changing experience.
Right, and we have a sense of mission, and we need to honor that sense of mission. You know, spiritual growth is a natural part of who we are, and we shouldn't be stifling that. We should be letting it flower. Each one of us can open up and be who we were meant to be, and we just need to start looking around to see what our mission is.
Let's talk about Claire's story.
Claire, yeah. Claire was a very powerful woman in the New Haven area. Powerful in meaning that she had touched many, many people's lives. She had owned a restaurant in New Haven for like 35 years, and people loved her. You know, people talked about Claire. I unfortunately didn't get to meet her till the very end of her life. I was brought in about a month before she died, and stooped over and could not catch her breath. Her disease was making her lungs, let's say, like concrete. You know, they had no elasticity left, so she couldn't take a deep inhalation, and her exhalations were forced. And I got down on my knees to look at her because she was stooped over so badly, and I looked up into her eyes, and I said, Claire, how can I help you? And she said to me, you know, who are you? And I said, I've had this feeling, this sense as she was looking into my eyes that she had done a lot of her crossing over already, that she was more there than she was here. And I said to her, what do you see? Who do you think I am? And she said, I see love in your eyes. You know, I see wonderful love. And so I knew she could see that side, if she could see what was coming from me. And it was coming from me because I had been there. And I just said to her, Claire, I've been where you're going, you know, and I know it's going to be okay, and I'm here to help you. Anyway, and she had, you know, round-the-clock nurses. And so we had discussed the fact that when she was ready, she could call me and I would help her make her transition. Now, her nurse called about 3 weeks later, and I thought she must have already died. I was pretty surprised that she was still here. And the nurse called and said, you have to come immediately. And I was sitting with a dying patient, and I couldn't leave that patient. So I said, please tell Claire that I'm sitting with another dying patient and I can't leave. When would she like me to come? I think this person has one more day. This was on Thursday. Claire said to tell me to come on Sunday. So she waited till Sunday. I walked in. It was her daughter's house. She was sitting up in bed in that same position. And I said to her, Claire, how can I help you? She said, I can't sleep. I need to sleep. And I really didn't know what else to do. I mean, whenever I visit a dying patient, I'm usually praying. I'm usually just as concerned as anybody else that I'm not going to know what to do. So I just always ask Spirit to help me get my ego out of the way and let it come through, you know. And I'm a conduit for it, but I can't let my ego come in and tell me what to do. So the next thing I did, which felt right, was I climbed up into bed with her and got behind her and started massaging her back. I brought a hospital table over first and put a pillow on it and let her lean on that. And I was massaging her shoulders and her arms and her back with cream. And she fell asleep, and I just, leaned her back in bed and, told her daughter that I'd come back in a few days. And her daughter called an hour and a half later to say that her mother had died peacefully in her sleep. She waited for me. And that the daughter had a very, very strong sense that Spirit had been there, and that when she had looked in the room, she had seen the two of us bathed in Spirit. And this was not what you would call a spiritual or religious woman. And, that word got around Connecticut when I was still working at the university. People were afraid to let me touch them for a while. But that's what Claire needed. She needed to relax, and that's what Spirit was doing through me.
That is so sweet. It's so hard for me to talk half the time during this interview because it's so touching.
Well, let me just talk about the last chapter in the book, because I think that's the most important chapter. It's a chapter on denial. And I tell 3 stories in that. 2 are on what I consider to be unhealthy denial, and the last one is healthy denial, because sometimes denial works in our favor. In the first story, I am at odds not knowing what to do, because I'm dealing with a family, 3 daughters and a mother, who are screaming at the dying patient that he has to fight. He has to fight. He has to make it. They're not willing to let go. And this poor man, I mean, you can just see him week by week deteriorating. And finally, at the end of this story, which is a very short story, I'm sitting alone with him in his room in the hospital. His wife and 3 daughters are in the waiting room. And he tells me, this is it, I'm dying. And I said, do you want me to go get your wife and kids? And he said, no, please don't. I won't be able to go. They won't let me. And I had to finally let go of his hand. I had to realize that holding his hand was keeping him here too. So I let go, and this man died peacefully. And that was, I thought, so sad for his family that they lost those scenes together where they could have talked, because the mother and the 3 daughters the entire time were denying him that he was dying. They would not accept it. He would tell them over and over. So that's the first story of unhealthy denial. The second one, very briefly, was a woman in her late 80s in a nursing home, surrounded by her children and her husband. And I was called in by the nursing home because what they told me was she couldn't die. Could I please come in and figure out what was wrong? She couldn't die. She'd been dying for a week. And when I just stood there observing,
so weird.
Yeah, she told, how dying people will stop breathing for like 2 or 3 minutes and then they'll start up again. So you just have to be patient. So she stopped breathing, and I watched one of her daughters grab the other daughter by the shoulders, and that daughter was holding her hand. So the reaction was that they pulled this dying woman up, and what it did was it forced her to breathe again. She went, and there she was back. They weren't letting her just do this. So I walked up to both daughters and kind of pulled them back and said, we have to let her go now. And they were crying, no, no, no. And the father came up and said, we have to let Mama go now. And what we did was we all just stood there holding on to them for about an hour and a half, and she was able to die. See, because we keep pulling them back. The most loving thing we can do for a dying relative is give them permission to go. I mean, the last words I said to my father was, I love you, Daddy, you can go. And that was hard. It was very hard. But that's what we need to do as caregivers and as loved ones, is stop being in denial and realize that everybody dies sooner or later.
I can't imagine those 2 daughters, and I would, if it was me, I know I'd be screaming.
They were in their 60s too, but they didn't want to let her go, and she was going to go sooner or later. I mean, what I've seen is that when everybody leaves the room, they go.
Right.
Or
That's
if you
what I was
leave them alone
thinking.
for a couple hours, they go. So we did it with them all standing there. The last one, I want to emphasize that sometimes denial's okay. This was a 42-year-old physician who had a massive coronary and was in our ICU unit. And his wife was standing over him. He's in a coma. He was in a coma for 11 days, talking to him. I watched her do it for 2 days, and the second day I came up to her and I asked her if she had, kids at home and whatever, and she had little children at home. And I said, sooner or later you got to go home and rest and be with your kids. And she said, no, I can't leave him. If I leave him, I know he's going to go. I have to be here with him. And what I thought of, and this was back in the late 70s when nobody was talking about this yet, but I thought of my kids when they were little. So this is how spirit works. I had this flash of my kids at the kitchen table making all kinds of noise during dinner. And I said to her, tape record your kids at dinner tonight. Get all that noise on a tape and bring in a tape recorder, and we'll keep turning the tape over. This was before the tape recorders were turning over. I said, we'll keep turning the tape over so that he can hear the kids at the dinner table, and that'll keep him from going. And she did. She brought in the tape, and the next day we had a boom box taped to the headboard, the bars, and we would keep turning over this tape. And 11 days, he came out of the coma. And about
my God,
3 days later,
great.
they transferred him down to a room, and she came up and she found me a few days after that to tell me that he said he was in a tunnel the whole time, and the reason why he didn't continue down the tunnel was he could hear the noise of his kids at the dinner table, and that was keeping him here. Well, her denial of him dying was very healthy.
Oh, Barbara, that's so beautiful.
Yeah, it was amazing.
Well, tell me how, when you decide, I guess you just followed what the Spirit told you. It wasn't time for him to go, obviously.
Well, as long as his wife was in denial, I had to honor that. As caregivers, we can't enforce our agenda on other people. If she was going to be there, I was going to be there with her. But I had that flash of my kids at the dinner table when they were little, and I knew that was a message.
That's so great.
And we got her to go home and take a shower and relax.
I think that's wonderful.
Yeah.
Plus, he was only 42.
Yeah, he was only 42 young kids. And while we're talking about this, let me again emphasize that as caregivers or loved ones, we're not there to change what's going on. When I die, I'll have a chance to do it the way I want to do it. Okay, that's going to be my shot at what I consider a good death. But up until my death, I have to honor where everybody else is. I tell the story of my aunt in there who never used the D word. I helped her die. It was another incredible story, but she never, ever talked about the fact that she was dying. We always talked around it. And she died on a Sunday morning, and I said to her Wednesday, she was in a palliative care hospital. For the listening audience, if they don't know what that is, a palliative care hospital manages pain. They're not there to cure you. They're there to keep you comfortable until you die. So she was in a palliative care hospital, and she was very, very tense. And I knew it was the end because she had no ability yet anymore to take a deep breath. I knew that her lung tissue was gone. And I said to her, I could see she was tense. I said, Sylvia, are you afraid? And she said, yes. I said, what are you afraid of? She didn't use the D word. She said to me, I'm afraid I'm never going to leave here. And I said, oh, well, that's a very serious fear that everybody in this hospital has. You're not the only one. And I could immediately see relief. If everybody else had that fear, it wasn't as bad as she thought. And I said, the problem with fear, now this woman was on a lot of morphine, so I had to get real close to her, and I had my hand right in her face, and I held up my index finger, and I said, the problem with fear is it's this little, and I was making a little circle in front of her eyes, and then I started making the circle bigger, like a spiral, and it was getting bigger at the top. And I said to her, the problem is if we don't talk about our fear, it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I said, if you tell me about your fear, and then I brought my finger back down to the little circle, I said, if you tell me about your fear, we can keep it small.
That's great. That's great.
She thought about it for a few seconds, and she said, I think it's time for the kids to come. Now, her kids lived up in Michigan. And I said to her, oh, okay, when do you want them to come? Now, this was Wednesday. I said, do you want me to call them tonight? Do you want them to come tomorrow? She says, no, we can wait till Friday. This was one more day. So I called her kids, and they came down Friday night. Oh, the other thing I said to her was, what do you want to wear when the kids are here? And she said, Sunday morning, I want the children around me, and I want to be wearing my lavender negligee. And I went into her drawer, and I pulled it out. It was folded, very fresh. And Sunday morning, in her lavender negligee, her kids were around her and her husband, and she said goodbye, and she died. So she knew on Wednesday, she planned her own death. And I called her story knowing, because she knew, but she never used the D word. And
That's so funny.
As a healthcare professional and as a personal loved one of these people whose stories I'm telling, I have never once tried to change the way they've wanted things to be. I honor where they're at. But sometimes the magic happens. Sometimes we know Spirit is there running the show.
That's so beautiful. I love to hear about these. And if you just tuned in, you're listening to Barbara Harris Whitfield, who is discussing the stories in her book, Final Passage. I keep calling it Final Passages.
Yeah.
Final Passage, Sharing the Journey as This Life Ends, which I had a good friend who worked in hospice, and she said there was nothing to her more rewarding in her job than being in the room when one of her elderly patients would die.
Right. It's just like when I used to work in the labor rooms. We could be there for 8 hours and we never see the baby born. Sometimes we'd be lucky enough that the baby would be born on our shift, or you hear about it the next day. It's the same thing with our dying patients. We love them. We want to be with them as they're actually making their transition. This is why I do hospice workshops now, too, because I find that people in the hospice movement are so open to this and they want to hear more. They want more skills, but they're wide open to it. It's nothing that they, shun or run away from.
Well, we haven't talked a lot about people really before they start doing the work and preparing to die. But what about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross? I didn't tell you I was going to ask you about this, but I hear that she did write someone a hospice in Rome, Georgia, and told them that she was doing much better after that article came out in Vanity Fair. But it broke my heart that, she wrote all about this transition process, and then she was furious.
Well, I know Elizabeth, and I've worked with her, and she's a real character. And she's feisty.
Yeah.
She's very, very feisty.
So that part of her personality would come out.
Oh. She is a feisty lady. And so, if they're going to give her an argument, that'll keep her alive. That'll keep her going a lot longer because she'll just be able to argue back and forth. She loves controversy, as does Kevorkian.
That's true.
I guess all of us in Death and Dying are characters.
That's true. Well, has she come more to peace with it? Do you know, or do you have any idea?
I don't know. I haven't talked to her in a while. I know that she's been pretty angry, but she's dying herself. She has something going on. I didn't read the Vanity Fair article. I heard about it.
Oh, it was all about how angry she was and how she said, "Oh, all that shit I wrote about." Well, it just sounds like her personality,
The stages.
Oh, the stages. It's nothing.
Well, it's been thrown out of a lot of universities. They're not talking about the stages anymore because, even though those stages are there, I guess it's too concrete. The whole idea of going through these stages and then you're ready to die, I've never experienced it that way, helping people. That we just bounce around through all the stages.
Like a spiral instead of a...
She validated that those feelings are there, so that was groundbreaking work. But then academically, the academic community turned on her and said, no, this isn't the way it is, that we've got to be much more flexible, that this is going to bounce around, that nobody gets through their anger, nobody gets to acceptance, everybody's just bouncing around. And we are. That's a natural condition for us to just bounce around in our feelings. I think of...
That's a good point.
I think of feelings like a blown-up balloon, and the balloon the knot isn't tied, and we can let a little bit of air out at a time through the mouth of the balloon. That's what feelings are like. We can let a little bit out so we're not uncomfortable, but those feelings are there. We're human.
So even though she was denying it, she was just angry. She's dying. We're coming to the end of our time today, so thanks for coming on the show,
Oh, it's
Barbara.
my pleasure. Thank you.